At my father's 60th birthday party, my own family stood up and called me the biggest disappointment they'd ever raised. In front of 80 guests, my sister Christina gave a toast that cut me down to nothing while my parents smiled and nodded along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what they didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something they never expected. And by the end of that night, I wasn't just fighting back. I was holding the keys to everything they thought they owned. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering that screamed expensive taste. Richard Torres cordially invites you to celebrate 6 decades of life, leadership, and legacy. The address was printed in elegant script. Riverside Country Club, Saturday evening, cocktails at 6. At the bottom, in smaller print, family reception to follow. I held the invitation up to the light streaming through my downtown Columbus apartment window, checking if my name was actually printed anywhere. It wasn't. The envelope had been addressed to Danielle Torres, but inside, there was no mention of me being family, no special seating assignment, no indication that I was anything more than another guest expected to show up and applaud. My phone buzzed with a text from Christina. "Hope you got the invite. Mom wasn't sure you'd want to come since you've been so busy with your little marketing job." Even through a screen, I could hear the condescension dripping from every word. My little marketing job had just landed a 6-figure contract with the largest healthcare system in Ohio. But to them, anything that wasn't Torres Construction Company might as well have been selling lemonade on a street corner. I tossed the invitation onto my kitchen counter and stared out at the city skyline. Columbus wasn't New York or Chicago, but it was mine. I'd built a life here that had nothing to do with concrete mixers, building permits, or the family business, that had consumed every conversation at every dinner table for as long as I could remember. My apartment was small but clean, with exposed brick walls and tall windows that let in enough light to grow the herbs I used for cooking. It was quiet, peaceful, and completely free of the constant judgment that followed me whenever I stepped foot in Maple Ridge. But this was Dad's 60th, and despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to skip it entirely. Richard Torres had spent 40 years building Torres Construction from a 2-man operation into the largest residential contractor in central Ohio. He'd earned his celebration, even if his idea of family had always been more selective than I'd hoped for. I pulled out my laptop and did what I always did before any family gathering: research. Not research about Dad or the party, but research about the family business, the properties, the financial records that were surprisingly easy to access when you knew where to look. My degree in business analytics hadn't been completely wasted, even if my parents still introduced me as Danielle. She works with computers. What I found that afternoon changed everything. The Torres Construction financial filings told a story my family had never shared with me. The company was struggling, not failing exactly, but bleeding money in ways that suggested years of poor decisions and expensive mistakes. There were liens against properties, delayed payments to subcontractors, and a pattern of borrowing that looked increasingly desperate. The family home on Maple Ridge Drive, the one Dad had built himself in 1995 with his own crew, was listed as collateral on 3 different loans. But here was the interesting part. Christina's name was on everything. Every loan, every lien, every financial decision made over the past 5 years had her signature attached. She wasn't just the golden child anymore. She was the one steering the ship while it slowly took on water. I closed the laptop and made myself dinner, but I couldn't stop thinking about those numbers. $300,000 in outstanding debt. Property taxes 6 months behind. A mortgage refinance that had tripled the monthly payments on a house that was supposed to be paid off years ago. Christina's real estate development company had been using Torres Construction as a piggy bank, and now both businesses were circling the drain. The next morning, I called Uncle Frank. He was Dad's younger brother, the one who'd walked away from the construction business 20 years ago to become an accountant. Frank had always been kind to me, probably because he understood what it felt like to be the family member who chose a different path. "Danielle, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" His voice was warm but tired. Frank had been asking me that question for years, usually after family gatherings where I'd been ignored or dismissed. "I'm fine, Uncle Frank." But I wanted asking, "You something about the business? Are things as bad as they look on paper?" There was a long pause. "What papers are you looking at? Public filings? Loan documents? It's all available if you know where to search." Frank sighed heavily. "Your father doesn't know I know, but yes, Christina has been making decisions that, well, let's just say I wouldn't have advised them. She's been treating the company like her personal investment fund for her development projects. Most of them haven't worked out." "And the house?" Another pause. "The house was supposed to be safe. That was the deal when your parents signed it over as collateral. Christina promised she could turn things around before anyone had to worry about losing it. But that was 2 years ago, and things have only gotten worse." I felt something settle in my chest, not quite anger, but something colder and more focused. "Uncle Frank, what would happen if someone paid off those loans?" "Well, theoretically, they'd own whatever was used as collateral." "But Danielle, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why are you asking?" I didn't answer directly. Instead, I asked him to send me the exact figures, the account numbers, the contact information for the lenders. Frank hesitated, but eventually agreed. He'd always believed I was smarter than the rest of the family gave me credit for, and maybe this was his way of proving it. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor, a sharp woman named Helen, who'd been helping me manage the money I'd been quietly saving and investing for the past 8 years. The second was to the bank that held the primary mortgage on my parents' house. The third was to a real estate attorney who specialized in distressed property acquisitions. By Thursday, I had a plan. By Friday, I had the paperwork. By Saturday morning, I had everything I needed to change my family's story forever. The Riverside Country Club sat on 15 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the Scioto River. It was the kind of place where Columbus's old money went to feel important, with crystal chandeliers in the dining room and oil paintings of long-dead civic leaders lining the hallways. Dad had been a member for 10 years, ever since Torres construction had grown large enough to require the kind of networking that happened over 18 holes in Bourbon. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple black dress that Christina would undoubtedly find fault with later. The valet took my keys with the polite indifference reserved for cars that weren't luxury brands, and I walked through the front doors into a world that had never quite felt like it belonged to me. The cocktail reception was already in full swing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 80 guests milled around the main ballroom, a mix of construction industry contacts, family friends, and relatives I saw only at weddings and funerals. Dad stood near the bar in his best suit, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd worked so hard to become. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his handshake firm as he worked the room with the confidence of someone who'd earned his place in it. Mom, Patricia, held court near the windows overlooking the golf course. She wore a navy dress with pearl earrings and the kind of smile that suggested she was keeping track of who'd shown up and who'd chosen to stay home. She'd always been the social architect of the family, the one who decided which relationships were worth maintaining and which could be quietly discarded. Christina was impossible to miss. She'd positioned herself at the center of the room, wearing a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, holding a champagne flute like a scepter while a small crowd of admirers hung on her every word. At 35, she'd mastered the art of looking successful, and tonight she was performing that success for an audience that included several potential investors in her latest development project. I picked up a glass of wine from a passing server and found a spot near the back of the room where I could observe without being obvious about it. This was a skill I'd perfected over years of family gatherings: how to be present without drawing attention, how to listen without appearing, to eavesdrop, how to exist on the margins while everyone else occupied the center stage. "Danielle, I wasn't sure you'd make it." Mrs. Peterson, an old family friend, appeared beside me with a warm smile. She'd been Dad's secretary for 15 years before retiring, and she'd always treated me with more kindness than my own relatives. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Dad looks happy." "He does, though I have to say he's been worried lately. Business troubles, you know. But Christina keeps telling everyone she has it all under control." I nodded, filing away that piece of information. If Mrs. Peterson knew about the financial problems, they were probably worse than I'd thought. Richard Torres wasn't the kind of man who shared business concerns with former employees unless those concerns were keeping him awake at night. Dinner was announced at 7:30. The ballroom had been transformed with round tables covered in white linens and centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. I found my assigned seat at table 9, as far from the head table as possible, while still being technically inside the same room. My dinner companions were a mix of distant cousins and family friends who made polite conversation about the weather and the upcoming election, while carefully avoiding any mention of what I did for work or why I lived downtown instead of in the suburbs like a proper Torres family member. The meal passed slowly. Filet mignon and roasted vegetables, wedding cake quality food served on china that probably cost more per plate than most people spent on groceries in a week. I ate mechanically, my attention focused on the head table where Dad sat between Mom and Christina, looking like a king flanked by his most trusted advisors. After the dessert course, the toasts began. Dad's business partner went first, sharing stories about the early days of Torres construction and the stubborn determination that had built it into a success. A longtime family friend followed with memories of backyard barbecues and Little League games, painting a picture of the kind of father and husband who showed up for what mattered. Then Christina stood up. She looked radiant under the ballroom lights, confident in the way that comes from a lifetime of being told you're exceptional. She tapped her champagne flute with a silver knife, and the room fell silent with the kind of attention usually reserved for wedding toasts or eulogies. "Most of you know me as Richard's daughter," she began, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "But what you might not know is that I'm also his successor. For the past 5 years, I've been working alongside my father to not only continue the Torres construction legacy, but to expand it in ways that honor everything he's built while positioning us for the future." Polite applause rippled through the room. I set down my wine glass and focused on her words, knowing that whatever came next would be important. Dad always taught us that success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about who you become in the process. It's about integrity, hard work, and the courage to make difficult decisions when they need to be made. Christina paused, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Unfortunately, not everyone in our family has learned those lessons. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt 80 pairs of eyes turn toward table 9, toward me, sitting alone in my simple black dress with nowhere to hide. "Some people choose the easy path," Christina continued, her voice steady and clear. "They take whatever handouts they can get, they avoid responsibility, and they criticize from the sidelines instead of rolling up their sleeves and doing the work. Some people become disappointments despite every opportunity they've been given." I couldn't breathe. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen for maximum impact. Around me, I could hear the uncomfortable shifting of chairs, the nervous clearing of throats, the whispered conversations that would follow me for months. "But tonight isn't about disappointment," Christina said, her tone shifting back to celebration. "Tonight is about honoring a man who never took the easy path, who built something lasting with his own hands, and who raised at least one daughter who understands what that means." The applause that followed was thunderous. People stood, raising their glasses to Dad and to Christina, to the success story they represented and the legacy they were building together. Dad beamed with pride, his arm around Christina's shoulders as she basked in the approval of everyone who mattered to our family's social standing. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully composed. I didn't stand. I didn't clap. I didn't cry, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to disappear, to never subject myself to this kind of public humiliation again. Instead, I waited. I waited while the applause died down and Christina took her seat. I waited while Dad stood to give his own speech about gratitude and family and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who shared your values. I waited while the evening gradually wound down and guests began filtering toward the coat check and the valet stand. And while I waited, I thought about the envelope in my purse, the one containing documents that would change everything these people thought they knew about the Torres family story. The one that would transform me from the family disappointment into something they'd never expected me to become. The person who held their future in her hands. The drive home was quiet. I took the long way through downtown, past the office buildings, where I'd built my career, in the apartment complex where I'd learned to live independently. The city lights reflected off my windshield like stars, and for the first time all evening, I felt like I could breathe again. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down at my kitchen table with the envelope I'd carried all evening but never opened. Inside were loan documents, property deeds, and a cashier's check that represented 8 years of careful saving, smart investing, and the kind of financial discipline that apparently counted for nothing in my family's estimation of my worth. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the family disappointment would become the person who owned the house on Maple Ridge Drive. Tomorrow, I would stop being invisible. But tonight, I sat in my quiet apartment and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just Christina's words, but years of being overlooked, dismissed, and erased from the narrative of my own family. Tonight, I mourned the relationship I'd always hoped we might have, and I prepared for the conversation we were actually going to have instead. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October weather that made Columbus feel smaller and more claustrophobic than usual. I woke before my alarm, my mind already racing with the events of Saturday night and the decision I'd made in the quiet hours afterward. The humiliation still stung, but it had crystallized into something harder and more useful. Absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, reviewing the financial documents one more time. The numbers hadn't changed overnight. Torres Construction owed $340,000 across 3 different loans, all secured by the family home on Maple Ridge Drive. The house itself was worth approximately $480,000 according to recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. Christina had been making minimum payments for 6 months, and 2 of the loans were already in technical default. What my family didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend making phone calls. Not angry, emotional calls demanding apologies or explanations, but professional conversations with loan officers, real estate attorneys, and my financial advisor, Helen. By Sunday evening, I had a complete picture of exactly how deep the hole was and exactly what it would take to climb out of it. The plan was simple in its brutality. I would pay off all 3 loans directly to the lenders, which would trigger an immediate transfer of the collateral to me. The house that Dad had built with his own hands, the house where Christina and I had grown up, the house that represented everything the Torres family had achieved, would legally belong to me within 48 hours of my payments clearing. I called in sick to work. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of Saturday night had left me feeling hollow and disconnected, like I was operating my body from somewhere outside it. But mostly, I needed the day to handle the logistics of what was about to happen. My first stop was Fifth Third Bank downtown, where I met with Margaret Chen, the loan officer who'd been handling the Torres construction account. She was a small, efficient woman in her 50s who treated financial crises with the same calm, professionalism that emergency room doctors reserved for car accidents. "Ms. Torres, I have to say I'm surprised to see you here," Margaret said as we settled into her office. "Your sister has been our primary contact for the past 2 years. I'm aware. I'm here because I'd like to discuss paying off the outstanding balance in full." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "The full balance? We're talking about $127,000 on this particular loan." I slid a cashier's check across her desk. "Will this cover it, including any fees or penalties?" She stared at the check for a long moment, then pulled up the account on her computer. "This would actually cover the balance and late fees with a small amount left over. But Ms. Torres, I need to ask, does your family know you're doing this?" "They will." Margaret nodded slowly. In her line of work, she'd probably seen enough family financial drama to recognize the signs. "I'll need to verify the funds and process the paperwork. This should be complete by close of business tomorrow." "And then the collateral transfers to me?" "According to the terms of the original loan agreement, yes. The property deed will be updated to reflect your ownership once all 3 liens are satisfied." I left the bank with a receipt and a strange sense of lightness, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. 2 more banks, 2 more cashier's checks, 2 more conversations with loan officers who tried to hide their curiosity behind professional courtesy. By Tuesday afternoon, it was done. I owned 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, Columbus, Ohio, 43214. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Christina and I had shared a bathroom and fought over closet space, where Dad had taught us both how to use power tools in the basement workshop he'd built when we were in elementary school. The house where, 3 days earlier, my own sister had called me the family disappointment in front of 80 people. I drove to Maple Ridge that evening, parking across the street under the maple trees that had given the neighborhood its name. The leaves were just starting to turn, patches of gold and red scattered among the green like a promise of the change coming. The house looked exactly the same as it had my entire life. Red brick with white trim, a covered front porch with 2 rocking chairs, flower beds that Mom maintained with military precision. There were lights on in the kitchen and living room. Through the sheer curtains I could see movement, the familiar dance of a family going through their evening routine. Dad would be in his recliner watching the news. Mom would be cleaning up after dinner, probably planning tomorrow's meals and making lists of things that needed to be done around the house. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of domestic tranquility that real estate agents used in their marketing materials. They had no idea that their peaceful scene was built on a foundation that no longer belonged to them. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the house and thinking about the conversation that was coming. Not tonight. I wasn't ready for that level of confrontation yet. But soon. Very soon. Wednesday brought the first sign that word was starting to spread. Uncle Frank called me at work, his voice tight with something between concern and excitement. "Danielle, I just got off the phone with Margaret Chen at Fifth Third. She said you paid off the construction loan yesterday." "That's right." "And the other 2 loans as well?" "Also right." There was a long pause. "Honey, do you understand what you've done?" I leaned back in my office chair, looking out at the downtown Columbus skyline through my window. "I understand exactly what I've done, Uncle Frank. The question is whether the rest of the family will understand it. Your father is going to lose his mind." My father was going to lose his house. Now he's just going to lose his illusions about who's been managing his finances. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Christina doesn't know yet, does she?" "Not unless the banks called her. But they wouldn't have any reason to. The loans are satisfied, the liens are released, and the collateral has been transferred to the new owner. As far as they're concerned, it's a clean transaction." "Jesus, Danielle. I knew you were smart, but this..." He trailed off, and I could hear him processing the implications. Your sister is going to come unglued. My sister has been coming unglued for months. She just did it quietly, in boardrooms and bank offices where the rest of the family couldn't. See? Now everyone gets to watch. That evening, I finally called the house. Mom answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the slight wariness she'd developed whenever I called during family dinner time. Hi, Mom. Is Dad available? I need to talk to both of you about something important. What's wrong? You sound strange. I'm fine, but we need to have a conversation, and it should be in person. Would tomorrow evening work? There was a pause, and I could hear her covering the phone to speak to Dad. He wants to know if this is about Saturday night. He feels terrible about Christina's speech. My grip tightened on the phone. Dad felt terrible, but apparently not terrible enough to call me himself or to address what had happened publicly. It's not about the speech, Mom. It's about the house. The house? What about the house? I'll explain everything tomorrow. 7 o'clock? Another pause, longer this time. Danielle, you're scaring me. I'm not trying to scare anyone. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation for once. Thursday crawled by with the kind of slow-motion anticipation usually reserved for job interviews or medical test results. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation ahead and all the ways it could go wrong. I'd played out dozens of scenarios, from shouting matches to stunned silence to attempts at negotiation that would never work because the deed transfer was already complete. At 6:30, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear to tell your parents that you now owned their house. I settled on dark jeans and a sweater, clothes that said I was serious but not trying to intimidate anyone. Though honestly, the situation was going to be intimidating enough without any help from my wardrobe. The drive to Maple Ridge took 12 minutes, the same amount of time it had taken when I was 16 and desperate to get home before curfew. But tonight, I wasn't worried about breaking rules or disappointing anyone. Tonight, I was coming home as the owner of the property, with a legal right to be there that superseded any family dynamics or emotional manipulation. Dad answered the door, looking older than he had on Saturday night. The celebration was over, and without the energy of a party to buoy him up, he seemed tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Danielle, come in, sweetheart. Mom was waiting in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to bolt. She'd changed out of her work clothes into a tracksuit, but her posture was rigid with anxiety. The room smelled like the vanilla candles she lit every evening, a scent that had meant comfort and safety for most of my life. Would you like coffee? Or tea? Mom's voice was higher than usual, the way it got when she was trying to manage a situation she didn't understand. I'm fine, thanks. I sat down in the chair across from them, the same chair I'd occupied during family meetings about curfews and college plans and summer jobs. I need to tell you both something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Dad leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. What's going on, honey? I took a breath and looked directly at him. I know about the loans. Dad. I know about the liens against the house, and I know that Christina has been making the financial decisions for Torres construction for the past 2 years. I also know that you're behind on payments and that the house was in danger of foreclosure. The color drained from Dad's face. Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. How do you... Dad started, then stopped. Christina told us she had everything under control. Christina told you what she needed to tell you to keep you from asking questions. But the reality is that Torres Construction is in serious financial trouble, and this house was collateral on loans that were about to go into default. Mom found her voice. Were? What do you mean, were? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing copies of all the paperwork. I mean that as of yesterday, all 3 loans have been paid in full. The liens have been released, and the house is no longer in danger of foreclosure. Dad blinked, his mind clearly trying to process what I just said. Who paid them? Did Christina find an investor? I paid them, Dad. All of them. With my own money. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. That's impossible, Mom whispered. The amounts. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. 340,000 to be exact, plus fees and penalties. Dad was staring at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. Danielle, where would you get that kind of money? I saved it. I invested it. I managed it carefully for 8 years while everyone assumed I was wasting my time with my little marketing job. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. Turns out that little job paid well enough to build a substantial nest egg, especially when you live modestly and don't spend money trying to impress people who aren't impressed anyway. Mom's hands were shaking. But why? Why would you do this without telling us? Because if I'd told you, Christina would have found a way to stop me. She would have convinced you that I was trying to manipulate the situation or take advantage of the family crisis. She would have made it about control instead of about solving the problem. This is about control, Dad said quietly. Isn't it? I met his eyes directly. Yes, it is, but not in the way you think. I opened the folder and pulled out the deed transfer documents. When you secure a loan with collateral and someone else pays off that loan, the collateral transfers to the person who made the payment. It's standard procedure, designed to protect lenders from borrowers who might try to manipulate the system. Dad reached for the papers with hands that weren't quite steady. I watched his face as he read, watched the exact moment when he understood what the legal language meant. You own the house, he said. It wasn't a question. As of yesterday. Afternoon, yes. Mom made that small sound again, and this time it was definitely a whimper. Our house. You own our house. The house that was about to be foreclosed on because Christina made promises she couldn't keep and took risks with money that wasn't hers to risk. Dad set the papers down on the coffee table like they were radioactive. What do you want? Danielle, what's your endgame here? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for the past 3 days. What did I want? Revenge? Vindication? An apology that would never come? Or something more complicated than any of those things? I want honesty, I said finally. I want acknowledgement that I've been treated like an outsider in my own family for years, and that Saturday night was just the culmination of a pattern that's been going on since we were kids. I want recognition that Christina isn't the business, genius everyone thinks she is, and that her decisions have consequences that affect more than just her own life. Mom was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. We never meant to make you feel like an outsider. But you did. Every time you introduced Christina as your successful daughter and me as the one who works with computers. Every time you asked her advice about important decisions and asked me about the weather. Every time you celebrated her achievements and tolerated my presence. Dad was looking at his hands. We were proud of Christina's success in the construction business. It felt like she was carrying on the family tradition. And what about my success? What about the fact that I built a career from nothing, that I've been financially independent since I was 22, that I just spent $350,000 to save the house you built with your own hands? We didn't know, Mom said. We didn't know you had that kind of money, or that you'd been watching the business situation, or that you even cared about the house. You didn't know because you never asked. You never asked about my work beyond the polite surface questions. You never asked about my investments or my plans or my life beyond whether I was dating anyone or when I might get married and give you grandchildren. The words hung in the air between us, years of accumulated hurt finally given voice. I hadn't planned to say so much, but once I started, it was like a dam breaking. All the birthday parties where my achievements went unmentioned, all the family gatherings where I was treated like a guest in my own family, all the times I'd driven home, from Maple Ridge feeling invisible and wondering what I'd done wrong. So what happens now? Dad asked. Do we need to move out? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. For all my planning and preparation, I hadn't fully considered the emotional reality of what I'd done. These were my parents, sitting in their living room surrounded by 30 years of memories, asking if they had to pack up their lives because their daughter had outmaneuvered them in a financial crisis they'd tried to handle without her. I don't want you to move out, I said. I never wanted that, but things are going to be different. Different how? I thought about Christina's toast, about the word disappointment delivered like a slap in front of 80 people who mattered to my family's social standing. I thought about the years of being dismissed and overlooked and treated like my presence was optional. Christina doesn't make decisions about this house anymore. She doesn't use it as collateral. She doesn't refinance it. She doesn't treat it like her personal ATM. If she wants to run Torres construction into the ground, that's between her and the business creditors. But this house is off limits. Dad nodded slowly. That seems fair. And we're going to have regular family meetings, monthly, where we talk about real things, not just weather and sports scores, where I get to have opinions about family decisions, and where those opinions are heard and considered. Okay. And if there's ever another family gathering where someone gives a speech about disappointments and failures, they better be prepared to have that conversation in private afterward. Because I'm done being the family punching bag. Mom was still crying, but she nodded. We're sorry, Danielle. We really are. We never meant for things to get this bad. I believed her, which somehow made it worse. They hadn't meant to hurt me, which meant they'd done it unconsciously, automatically, as part of a family dynamic that felt natural to them and suffocating to me. I know you didn't mean it, I said. But impact matters more than intent. And the impact of the way you've treated me has been that I felt like I had to choose between being part of this family and being myself. And now? Dad asked. Now I'm both. Whether that works for everyone else is up to them. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of 30 years of family history settling around us like dust. Outside, I could hear children playing. In someone's backyard, the ordinary sounds of suburban life continuing, regardless of the tectonic shifts happening in living rooms across the neighborhood. Does Christina know? Mom asked finally. Not yet, but she will soon enough. The banks will send updated paperwork, and she'll figure it out when she tries to use the house as collateral for whatever her next brilliant business idea happens to be. Dad winced. She's going to be furious. Christina has been furious at me for years. The only difference is that now she has a concrete reason instead of just a general sense that I don't fit the family narrative. She loves you, Mom said. She really does. She's competitive. She always has been. There's a difference between competitive and cruel, Mom. What she said on Saturday night crossed that line. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. I should go. You both need time to process this, and I need time to figure out what comes next. Dad walked me to the door, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both familiar and strange. For what it's worth, sweetheart, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I may not have said it enough, but I am. Thanks, Dad. That means something. Will you come to dinner on Sunday? We could try again. All of us. I thought about Sunday dinners at the Maple Ridge house, the weekly ritual of pot roast and small talk, and carefully avoided, "Trostio, maybe. Let me see how the rest of the week goes." The drive back to my apartment felt different somehow, like I was traveling between two versions of my life. The version where I was the family disappointment who lived downtown and worked with computers, and the version where I was the person who owned the house on Maple Ridge Drive and had just rewritten the rules of engagement for every future family interaction. My phone was buzzing when I got home. 3 missed calls from Christina, 2 text messages, and a voicemail that I deleted without listening to. Whatever she had to say could wait until I was ready to hear it. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, looking out at the city lights and thinking about power dynamics and family hierarchies and the difference between being loved and being respected. For 30 years, I'd been willing to settle for love that came with conditions and limitations. Love that required me to stay small, stay quiet, stay grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. But power, it turned out, was different. Power meant that my phone calls got returned, my opinions got heard, and my presence at family gatherings became something that mattered rather than something that was merely tolerated. Tomorrow, Christina and I would have our conversation. Tomorrow, the family would have to reckon with the fact that the disappointment had been paying attention all along, had been building something real while they were busy building narratives about success and failure that served everyone except the person they'd written out of the story. Tonight, though, I sat in my quiet apartment and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being underestimated by people who should have known better. The wine was good, the city was beautiful, and for the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards in a game I'd never agreed to play, but had somehow managed to win. Christina's Mercedes was already in the driveway when I pulled up to the house on Friday evening. I'd been expecting this moment since Wednesday, but seeing her car parked in the same spot where she'd been parking for family dinners since high school still made my pulse quicken. Through the living room window, I could see 3 silhouettes. Around the coffee table and even from the street, the body language looked tense. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the scene play out behind the sheer curtains. Christina was pacing, her hands moving in the animated gestures she'd perfected in boardroom presentations. Mom and Dad sat on the sofa, their shoulders rigid, with the kind of stress that comes from being caught in the middle of something they don't fully understand. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Get inside, now." No signature, but Christina's communication style had always been more command than request. I locked my car and walked up the front path, past the flower beds Mom had planted when Christina and I were in middle school, past the oak tree where Dad had hung a tire swing that we'd both outgrown before we'd learned to appreciate it. The front door was unlocked, which meant someone had been watching for me. "Danielle." Christina's voice hit me before I'd even closed the door behind me. She stood in the archway between the foyer and living room, wearing a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of severe bun that said she meant business, and her expression was colder than I'd seen since we were teenagers fighting over bathroom time. "Hello, Christina." "Don't you hello Christina me. What the hell did you think you were doing?" Mom stood up from the sofa, her hands fluttering nervously. "Girls, please, let's sit down and talk about this calmly." "Calmly?" Christina's voice rose half an octave. "Mom, she bought our house out from under us. There's nothing calm about this situation." I walked into the living room, noting that Christina had positioned herself between me and our parents like she was protecting them from some kind of threat. "I didn't buy it out from under you. I saved it from foreclosure. You manipulated a financial crisis for your own gain. That's what you did." Dad cleared his throat. "Christina, maybe we should listen to what Danielle has to say." "I know exactly what she has to say, Dad. She's going to tell us that she was trying to help, that she had our best interests at heart, that she's the hero in this story." Christina turned back to me, her eyes flashing with the kind of controlled anger that came from years of corporate negotiations. "But what she's really done is stage a hostile takeover of our family." I sat down in the chair I'd occupied 2 nights earlier, the same chair where I'd told our parents the truth about the loans and the house and Christina's financial mismanagement. "Is that what you're calling it? A hostile takeover?" "What would you call it?" "I'd call it an intervention." Christina laughed, but there was no humor in it. "An intervention? You think you're helping us?" "I think I prevented you from losing the house Dad built with his own hands. I think I stopped you from dragging Torres construction any deeper into debt while you chased development projects that were never going to work. And I think I saved our parents from having to find out about your failures when the foreclosure notice showed up in their mailbox." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Mom made a small sound and sat back down heavily on the sofa. Dad was looking between Christina and me like he was watching a tennis match, trying to follow a game whose rules he didn't entirely understand. "My failures?" Christina's voice was deadly quiet now. "I've been trying to save this family's business for 2 years while you've been playing with spreadsheets downtown. Do you have any idea what it's like to carry that kind of responsibility? Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love make terrible decisions and not be allowed to say anything about it?" I kept my voice level, refusing to match her emotional intensity. "I've been watching Torres Construction's financial filings for 3 years, Christina. I've seen every loan, every lien, every desperate attempt to keep the lights on. And not once did anyone in this family think to ask if I might have insights that could help. Because you don't work in construction. You don't understand the industry. I understand debt. I understand cash flow. I understand the difference between calculated risks and desperate gambles. And what you've been doing for the past 2 years falls squarely in the desperate gamble category." Christina turned to our parents. "Are you hearing this? She thinks she knows better than someone who's actually been running the business." "Running it into the ground," I said quietly. "That's enough." Dad's voice cut through the tension. With the authority he'd developed over 40 years of managing construction crews. "Both of you, that's enough." We fell silent, but the air in the room still crackled with unfinished arguments and accusations that had been building for years. I could see Mom twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd developed whenever Christina and I fought as children. "Danielle," Dad continued, "I want to understand something. You say you've been watching our financial situation for 3 years. Why didn't you say anything?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since Wednesday. Because every time I tried to have a serious conversation about family business, I was told it wasn't my concern. Every time I offered an opinion about financial decisions, I was reminded that I didn't work for Torres Construction. Every time I suggested that maybe the expansion plans were too aggressive, I was told that I didn't understand the big picture. Christina crossed her arms. "Because you didn't understand the big picture. The big picture where you leveraged Mom and Dad's house to fund development projects that never broke ground? The big picture where you borrowed against equipment that was already collateral on other loans? The big picture where you spent 18 months chasing investors for a strip mall project that was never going to get zoning approval?" Christina's face went pale. "How do you know about the strip mall?" "Because I know how to read public records. Because I know how to follow paper trails. Because while you were telling everyone that I work with computers like it was some kind of joke, I was actually using those computer skills to understand what was happening to our family's business." Mom looked confused. "What strip mall?" Christina shot me a look that could have melted steel. "It was a development opportunity. It didn't work out." "It was a $120,000 development opportunity that didn't work out," I corrected. "Money that came from refinancing. Equipment that was supposed to be paid off by now." Dad was very quiet. "Christina, is that true?" "Dad, you have to understand, in development, not every project works out. That's the nature of the business. You take calculated risks, and sometimes they don't pay off." "But you didn't tell us about the risks," Mom said. "You told us everything was under control." Everything was under control. I had backup plans, exit strategies. "Your exit strategy was to use this house as collateral on a bridge loan," I said. "I've seen the paperwork. You were going to borrow another $200,000 against the house to fund the next development project." The silence that followed was deafening. Christina stared at me with a mixture of shock and fury, like she couldn't believe I'd been able to access that level of detail about her business plans. "That's confidential information," she said finally. "It's family information. And it's the reason I had to act when I did. If I'd waited another month, you would have put the house at risk for an even larger amount, and we'd all be having a very different conversation right now. Dad leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. Jesus Christ. Christina, the house? It was going to be temporary, just until the Riverside project got approved. What Riverside project? Mom asked. Christina looked trapped, like someone who'd been caught in a lie that was bigger than any explanation she could offer. It's a mixed-use development on the east side, retail and residential. It's going to be huge. It's going to be huge if you can get the environmental impact study approved, if you can get the zoning variance, if you can secure the additional investors you need, and if the city council doesn't kill it in committee, I said. That's a lot of ifs to bet our parents' house on. How do you know about the environmental study? Because I called the zoning office. Because I looked up the property records. Because I spent 2 hours on the phone with a very helpful city planner who explained exactly what would have to happen for that project to move forward. I looked directly at her. Did you know that the soil samples showed elevated levels of industrial contamination? Did you know that cleanup costs alone could run $500,000 before you even break ground? Christina's composure finally cracked. You had no right to interfere with my business. I had every right to protect my family from your business. Your family? Your family? Her voice was rising again. Where have you been for the past 10 years while I've been working 18-hour days trying to build something meaningful? Where were you when Dad had his heart attack, and I was the one handling everything? Where were you when we needed someone to step up and take responsibility? The accusation hit home because it contained just enough truth to sting. I had been absent from many family crises over the years, partly by choice and partly because I'd been made to feel like my presence wasn't particularly wanted or needed. I was building a career, I said. I was learning skills that turned out to be exactly what this family needed when the crisis got big enough. I was saving money and making investments that allowed me to write checks for $340,000 when the alternative was losing everything. Money you made while the rest of us were doing the real work. Real work? The phrase pushed me past my limit of diplomatic conversation. Christina, what do you think I do all day? What do you think marketing analytics actually involves? I think you make PowerPoint presentations for healthcare companies. I build predictive models for healthcare systems that serve 2 million patients across 4 states. I analyze data streams that help hospitals reduce readmission rates and improve patient outcomes. I manage budgets that would make Torres Construction's annual revenue look like pocket change. I was standing now, my voice carrying more emotion than I'd intended. And I've been doing it while listening to jokes about my little computer job. For 8 years. Mom was crying again, the quiet tears of someone who was watching her family fall apart in real time. Please stop fighting. Please. This isn't what we wanted. What did you want, Mom? I asked. Did you want Christina to lose the house to foreclosure? Did you want Dad to find out about the financial problems when the sheriff showed up with eviction papers? Because that's where we were headed. I wanted us to work together, Mom said. I wanted my daughters to support each other instead of tearing each other down. I tried to support her, I said. I tried for years to be included in family business discussions. I tried to offer help when I could see that things were going wrong. But every time I opened my mouth, I was told that I didn't understand, that I wasn't qualified, that I should stick to my computers and leave the real business decisions to the people who knew what they were doing. Christina was pacing again, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. So this is revenge? You've been planning this for years? This isn't revenge. This is consequences. Consequences for what? For treating me like an outsider in my own family, for making financial decisions that put our parents at risk without consulting anyone, for standing up at Dad's birthday party and calling me a disappointment in front of 80 people. My voice was steady now, calmer than it had been all evening. For assuming that because I chose a different career path, I couldn't possibly have anything valuable to contribute to this family's success. Dad looked up from his hands. The birthday party. That's what this is really about, isn't it? The birthday party was the final straw. But this has been building for a long time. Christina stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. Fine. You want an apology for the birthday party? I'm sorry. I was stressed about the business situation, and I took it out on you in a public way that was inappropriate. There. Are you happy now? I studied her face, looking for any sign that the apology was genuine rather than strategic. Are you sorry you said it? Or are you sorry that it had consequences? What's the difference? The difference is whether you actually understand what you did wrong. Christina threw her hands up in exasperation. What I did wrong was trust you to be a supportive family member instead of a vindictive opportunist. What you did wrong was spend 2 years making financial decisions that could have cost our parents their home, and then blame me for being the person who prevented that from happening. Girls. Dad's voice was quiet but firm. Enough. We both turned to look at him. He seemed smaller somehow, worn down by the weight of discoveries that had fundamentally changed his understanding of his family and his business. Christina, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. How bad are things with Torres construction? Christina sat down heavily in the chair across from me, suddenly looking every one of her 35 years. Bad, Dad. Really bad. I've been trying to turn it around, but the construction market has been tough, and some of the development projects I invested in didn't work out the way I projected. How much debt are we talking about? Beyond the house loans that Danielle paid off? Probably another $200,000 in business debt. Equipment loans, supplier credit, payroll obligations. Dad was quiet for a long moment. And your plan was to use the house to secure more loans? Just temporarily, until I could get the Riverside project approved and bring in some investors. Christina, the house isn't yours to use as collateral anymore. I know that now. I looked around the room at my family, all of us sitting in the aftermath of revelations that had changed everything we thought we knew about each other. Christina, the golden child who'd been struggling in silence for 2 years. Dad, the successful businessman who'd been kept in the dark about his own company's financial crisis. Mom, caught in the middle of a conflict between her daughters that had been building for decades. So what happens now? Mom asked. What do we do? It was a good question. I'd spent so much energy planning the financial rescue and preparing for the confrontations that I hadn't given much thought to what came after. I owned the house, but I didn't want to be a landlord to my own parents. I'd exposed Christina's mismanagement, but I didn't want to destroy her entirely. I'd proven my point about being underestimated, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with that victory. Now we figure out how to be a family that tells each other the truth, I said. Now we figure out how to make decisions together, instead of assuming we know what's best for everyone else. Christina looked skeptical. You're saying you want to help with the business? I'm saying I want to be included in conversations about decisions that affect all of us. I'm saying that maybe the family disappointment has some skills that could be useful if anyone ever bothered to ask. And the house? The house stays in the family. But it doesn't get used as collateral for business ventures anymore. It doesn't get refinanced to fund development projects. It stays stable, the way a family home should be. Dad nodded slowly. That seems fair. What about Torres construction? Christina asked. If the business fails, a lot of people lose their jobs. Dad's legacy gets destroyed. I'd been thinking about that question since Tuesday, since the moment I'd realized that saving the house was only the first step in a much larger problem. Torres construction doesn't have to fail, but it can't keep operating the way it has been. Meaning what? Meaning it needs better financial management. Meaning it needs to focus on projects that make money instead of projects that sound impressive. meaning it needs someone who understands cash flow and risk management to be involved in major decisions. Christina stared at me. Are you offering to work for the family business? I'm offering to consult for the family business, part-time. Enough to help get the finances stabilized and the decision-making process improved. Why would you do that? Because despite everything that's happened, I don't want to see Dad's life's work destroyed. Because I don't want Christina to fail just to prove a point. And because maybe it's time for this family to actually work together instead of just pretending we do. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less hostile, more thoughtful, like we were all trying to imagine what it would look like to be a family that functioned as a team instead of a collection of individuals competing for attention and approval. There would have to be conditions, I said. Full financial transparency, monthly reports, no major expenditures or commitments without consultation, and no more public speeches about family disappointments. Christina almost smiled at the last condition. Deal. But I have conditions too. Such as? You don't get to come in and take over everything. You don't get to treat this like you're rescuing us from our own incompetence. And you have to actually show up for family dinners instead of hiding in your downtown apartment pretending we don't exist. It was my turn to almost smile. Deal. Mom was crying again, but this time they looked like tears of relief rather than stress. So we're going to be okay? Dad reached over and took her hand. We're going to figure it out. All of us together. What about Sunday dinner? Mom asked. Are you coming this week? I looked around the room, at the family I'd grown up thinking I didn't quite fit into, and realized that maybe the problem hadn't been my fit. Maybe the problem had been that we'd all been trying to squeeze into roles that were too small for who we actually were. Yeah, Mom, I'll be here for Sunday dinner. Christina stood up and smoothed down her skirt, the gesture automatic and professional. I should get going. I have some financial reports to prepare, apparently. Christina, I said as she reached for her purse. For what it's worth, I know you were trying to save the business. I know you were carrying a lot of pressure, and I know it wasn't easy. She paused at the living room archway. Thank you. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry about the birthday party. I was wrong to say what I said, and I was wrong to say it publicly. I know. After Christina left, I stayed for another hour, talking with Mom and Dad about practical things like utility bills and property taxes and what it meant for their homeowner's insurance now that the deed was in my name. But underneath, the logistics, we were really talking about trust and family and the difference between helping someone and controlling them. When I finally got back to my apartment that night, I felt exhausted but oddly hopeful. The confrontation with Christina had been as difficult as I'd expected, but it had also cleared the air in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, we'd actually talked to each other instead of talking past each other. My phone buzzed with a text message from Uncle Frank. Heard you and Christina worked things out. Proud of you for not burning the whole thing down. I typed back, the night is young. But I was kidding. For the first time since Dad's birthday party, I wasn't interested in burning anything down. I was interested in building something up, something that had space for all of us to be who we actually were instead of who we thought we were supposed to be. Outside my window, Columbus looked the same as it always did, but everything felt different. Tomorrow, I would start the process of integrating my downtown life with my family. Life of being the person who owned the house on Maple Ridge Drive and the person who had built a successful career in healthcare analytics. Tomorrow, I would start being all of who I was, instead of just the parts that fit neatly into other people's expectations. Tonight, though, I poured myself a glass of wine and called it a victory. The Columbus Business Journal arrived at my office on Tuesday morning with a headline that made my coffee taste bitter. Torres Construction Faces Restructuring Amid Family Leadership Changes. The article was brief but pointed, mentioning financial difficulties, management transitions, and unnamed sources within the construction industry who speculated about the company's future viability. I stared at the newspaper spread across my desk, wondering how long it would take for the story to reach the broader business community and what that would mean for Dad's reputation. 40 years of building something respected and successful, reduced to 3 paragraphs of speculation about financial mismanagement and family drama. My assistant knocked on my office door. "Danielle, there's a Richard Torres here to see you. He says he's your father." I looked up from the newspaper, surprised. Dad had never visited my office before, had never shown much interest in seeing where I worked or what my professional life looked like. "Send him in." Dad appeared in my doorway, looking uncomfortable in the way that people do when they're navigating unfamiliar territory. He wore his good khakis and a button-down shirt, the same outfit he'd worn to parent-teacher conferences when Christina and I were kids. "This is nice," he said, looking around at my office with its view of downtown Columbus and its walls covered with certificates and awards I'd earned over the years. "Really nice, sweetheart." "Thanks. What brings you downtown?" He held up a copy of the business journal. "Have you seen this?" "Just finished reading it. How did they find out so quickly?" Dad sat down in the chair across from my desk, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "Word travels fast in the construction business. When you start missing payments to subcontractors, people talk. When your financial situation becomes public record because of loan transfers, reporters start making phone calls." "I'm sorry, Dad. I never intended for this to become public." "I know you didn't, but that doesn't change the fact that it is." He set the newspaper on my desk and leaned back in his chair. 3 of my biggest clients called me yesterday. They want to know if Torres Construction is going to be able to complete their projects. The weight of what I'd set in motion was starting to settle on my shoulders. In focusing on the immediate crisis of the house and the loans, I hadn't fully considered the ripple effects of exposing the company's financial problems. "What did you tell them?" I told them the truth. That we're going through some restructuring, but that every project will be completed on schedule and on budget. Dad's voice was steady, but I could see the strain around his eyes. "The question is whether that's actually true." I pulled up a spreadsheet on my computer, one I'd been working on since our family meeting on Friday. "It can be true, but it's going to require some significant changes." "Show me." For the next hour, I walked Dad through the analysis I'd been preparing. Torres Construction had 23 active projects, ranging from single-family homes to a small commercial renovation. 17 of them were profitable and on track for completion. 4 were break-even propositions that should be finished but never repeated. 2 were bleeding money and needed immediate attention to avoid larger losses. "The Riverside Elementary Edition," I said, pointing to one of the problem projects. "Christina bid this one at cost just to get the contract, but the specifications changed 3 times after you started work. You're going to lose at least $30,000 if you complete it as currently structured." Dad nodded grimly. "I told Christina that bid was too low, but she said it was important for our reputation. In the education market, it's going to damage your reputation more if you go bankrupt trying to prove you can work for free." I switched to another screen. "But there's a solution. The change orders weren't properly documented, and the school district owes you additional compensation under the original contract terms. If you file the paperwork correctly, you can recover most of the losses." "And you know how to do that?" "I know how to read contracts, and I know how to document claims. It's not that different from the healthcare contract disputes I handle for my regular clients." Dad was quiet for a moment, studying the numbers on my screen. "What about the other problem project?" "The Murphy family custom home. Christina promised them upgrades that weren't in the original scope of work, and now you're providing $60,000 worth of materials and labor for free." I pulled up another set of documents. But Mrs. Murphy signed off on every upgrade request via email, and she acknowledged that additional costs would apply. She just assumed Christina would absorb those costs as customer service. Can we collect on that? We can try. And if Mrs. Murphy refuses to pay, you can place a lien on the property until the upgrades are compensated. It's not pleasant, but it's business. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking overwhelmed. Christina never mentioned any of this to me. She just kept saying she was handling the business side of things. Christina was trying to grow the company too fast. She was taking on projects that looked prestigious but weren't profitable, and she was making promises to clients that the business couldn't afford to keep. I turned my computer screen so he could see it better. But the underlying business is sound, Dad. Torres Construction has a good reputation, skilled workers, and a solid customer base. It just needs better financial management. Better financial management from someone who understands numbers. From someone who understands that business is about more than just building things. It's about building them profitably, sustainably, in ways that allow you to stay in business long enough to build the next thing. Dad was looking around my office again, taking in the details he'd missed when he first arrived. How long have you been doing this kind of work? Contract analysis? About 6 years. Financial modeling? Since college. And we never asked. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. You never asked. Jesus, Danielle, we really screwed this up, didn't we? I thought about the years of feeling excluded from family business. Discussions, the assumptions about my career and capabilities, the growing distance between my life and theirs. We all screwed it up, but we're fixing it now. My phone buzzed with a text message from Christina. Meeting with First National. Bank at 2 p.m. Need to discuss credit line extension. Can you be there? I showed the message to Dad. How do you feel about me representing Torres Construction in financial meetings? Honestly? Relieved. I've been out of my depth with the banking stuff for months. Christina kept insisting she had it under control, but every meeting seemed to make things more complicated. Banking doesn't have to be complicated. It just requires clear communication about what you need, what you can afford, and what your realistic timeline looks like. I started gathering papers from my desk. But if I'm going to represent the company, we need to have a clear understanding about decision-making authority. What kind of understanding? I need to be able to speak for Torres Construction in financial matters. Not just advise, but actually negotiate and make binding commitments on behalf of the business. Dad considered this for a moment. What about Christina? Christina remains the operational manager. She handles project management, client relationships, day-to-day business operations. But financial decisions go through me. She's not going to like that. She doesn't have to like it. She just has to accept it if she wants the business to survive. The meeting at First National Bank was held in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Scioto River. Christina arrived first, wearing another expensive suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment. She looked up when I walked in, her expression carefully neutral. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up, she said. Dad asked me to handle the financial discussions going forward. So I heard. Christina's tone was professional but cool. I hope you understand that banking relationships are about more than just numbers. There's a personal element, a trust factor that takes time to build. Before I could respond, James Mitchell, the bank's commercial lending officer, entered the conference room. He was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of careful smile that bankers perfect for delivering bad news in the most pleasant way possible. Ms. Torres, good to see you again, he said to Christina. Then he turned to me. And you must be the other Ms. Torres I've been hearing about. Danielle Torres. I'll be handling Torres Construction's financial matters going forward. James nodded and opened a file folder thick with documents. Well, let's get started. Christina, you mentioned wanting to discuss extending your credit line. But I have to tell you that given the recent changes in your collateral situation, that's going to be challenging. Christina's professional smile faltered slightly. What do you mean by challenging? I mean that your primary collateral for the existing credit line was the Maple Ridge property, which is no longer available as security for business loans. Without that collateral, your debt-to-asset ratio exceeds our lending guidelines. I leaned forward. What's the current balance on the credit line? James consulted his notes. $68,000 with a credit limit of $120,000. And the interest rate? Prime plus 3.5%. I did quick calculations in my head. So you're paying roughly 8% on money you're using to fund projects that should be generating 15 to 20% margins. Christina looked annoyed. It's not that simple. Construction projects have irregular cash flows. Sometimes, you need bridge financing to cover materials and labor before the client payments come in. I understand cash flow management, I replied. But borrowing at 8% to cover costs on projects where you're already operating at thin margins is a recipe for trouble. James cleared his throat. Which brings us to the current situation. Torres Construction needs to either provide additional collateral for the existing credit line, or will need to discuss a repayment schedule for the outstanding balance. Additional collateral isn't an option, I said, but repayment is. What kind of schedule are we talking about? Ideally, we'd like to see the balance paid down to $30,000 within 90 days, with the remainder paid over the following 6 months. Christina was shaking her head. That's not realistic given our current project timeline. We have payments coming in, but not on that schedule. I pulled out a folder containing the project analysis I'd prepared. Actually, it is realistic, if we manage the existing contracts properly. I spread several documents across the conference table. Torres Construction has outstanding change orders on 3 projects totaling $47,000. Those should be collected within 60 days if the claims are filed properly. James looked interested. What kind of change orders? Scope modifications that were requested by clients but never properly documented for billing. Additional materials, design changes, timeline extensions that required extra labor. I handed him a summary sheet. All of these are legitimate charges that should have been billed months ago. Christina was reading over my shoulder. How do you know about the Riverside Elementary change orders? Because I spent 3 hours yesterday going through your project files and contract documents. The school district requested modifications to the electrical and HVAC systems that added 2 weeks to the timeline and required materials that weren't in the original specification. Those were good faith accommodations to maintain the client relationship. Those were unbilled services that cost Torres Construction $12,000 in materials and labor. I turned back to James. If we collect on the outstanding change orders and implement better billing practices going forward, the credit line balance can be reduced to 0 within 4 months. James made notes in his file. And what about the credit line extension Christina originally requested? Not needed. Torres Construction's cash flow problems aren't because the business isn't profitable. They're because the business isn't collecting money it's already earned. Christina was looking through the change order documentation with growing recognition. I remember these requests, but I thought billing for every little modification would damage our relationships with repeat clients. Billing for legitimate additional work is standard practice in every construction market, I replied. Clients expect to pay for changes they request. What damages relationships is providing free services and then cutting corners on other aspects of the project to maintain profitability. James closed his file folder. It sounds like you have a plan for addressing the credit line balance. What about ongoing banking needs? We'll maintain the business checking and savings accounts, but we won't need credit facilities if we manage cash flow properly. I gathered my documents back into their folder. Torres Construction is going back to basics: profitable projects, timely billing, disciplined financial management. And if you need short-term financing for materials or equipment, we'll evaluate those needs as they arise, but the goal is to operate without borrowed money whenever possible. After James left, Christina and I sat in the empty conference room for several minutes without speaking. Through the windows, I could see office workers walking along the riverfront during their lunch breaks, living lives that probably didn't involve hostile takeovers of family businesses or public confrontations about financial mismanagement. "You made me look incompetent in there," Christina said finally. "I made the numbers look competent. There's a difference. You think I don't know how to run a business. I think you know how to run a construction operation. I think you're good with clients and project management and the technical aspects of building things." I turned to face her directly. "But I don't think you understand financial management, and I don't think you're comfortable asking for help when you need it." Christina was quiet for a moment. "The change orders you mentioned, I really thought I was doing the right thing by absorbing those costs." "You would have been doing the right thing if Torres Construction was generating enough profit margin to absorb them. But when you're operating on thin margins and carrying debt, every unbilled service puts the entire business at risk. So what now? You take over the financial side and I just follow orders? You run the business. I make sure the business stays financially healthy." I stood up and gathered my things. "Christina, you're good at what you do. The projects you manage are completed on time and on budget when they're priced correctly. Your clients are happy with the quality of work. The problem was never your competence as a construction manager. The problem was my competence as a business manager. The problem was that you were trying to do everything yourself instead of recognizing that different aspects of business require different skill sets." Christina stood up as well, smoothing down her skirt in the automatic gesture I'd noticed at our parents' house. "This is going to take some getting used to. For both of us." As we walked toward the elevator, Christina's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and stopped walking. "What is it?" I asked. "Mrs. Murphy. She wants to schedule a meeting about the final billing for her custom home." I smiled. "Guess she got your invoice for the upgrade work." "You really think she'll pay for modifications she thought were included?" "I think she'll pay for work that was done at her request once the documentation is explained properly. And if she doesn't, she'll pay when the lien is filed against her property." Christina shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "You're ruthless." "I'm practical. There's a difference." The elevator arrived, and we rode down to the lobby in comfortable silence. As we walked toward the parking garage, Christina turned to me with a question I'd been expecting. "Are you really going to come to Sunday dinner this week?" I said I would. "And you're really going to help save Torres Construction?" "I'm really going to try." Christina stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since we were children. "Why? After everything we put you through, after the way we treated you, why would you want to help us?" I thought about the question as we reached our cars, parked side by side in the underground garage. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the night I'd decided to pay off the loans and buy the house. "Because despite everything, you're still my family," I said. "Because Dad spent 40 years building something meaningful, and it would be a shame to let it fail because of pride or stubbornness or the inability to ask for help. And because you want to prove that the family disappointment was actually the one with the skills to save everyone." I considered that possibility honestly. Maybe a little bit of that too. Christina laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in years. "Fair enough. I guess I deserved that." We all deserve a chance to be seen for who we actually are instead of who people assume we are. Even the golden child who turned out to be not so golden. Especially the golden child who turned out to be human. We stood by our cars for another moment. Two sisters who'd spent most of their adult lives talking past each other instead of to each other, finally starting to have a real conversation. Danielle? Christina's voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. I really am sorry about the birthday party. Not just because it had consequences, but because it was cruel and unfair, and because you didn't deserve it. Thank you. That means something. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you bought the house. I'm glad you stopped me from making an even bigger mess of everything. You weren't making a mess. You were trying to save something you cared about with tools that weren't quite right for the job. Christina got into her Mercedes and rolled down the window. Sunday dinner is at 6. Mom's making pot roast. I'll be there. As I drove back to my apartment that afternoon, I thought about family dynamics and business relationships and the difference between being needed and being wanted. For 30 years, I'd wanted to be included in my family's life, wanted to be seen as valuable and capable, and worth consulting on important decisions. Now I was needed, genuinely needed in ways that were critical to my family's financial survival. It should have felt like vindication, like the ultimate proof that I'd been underestimated all along. Instead, it just felt like the beginning of something new, something where my value to the family wasn't contingent on staying small or quiet, or grateful for whatever attention came my way. Something where I could be all of who I was, including the parts that made other people uncomfortable. Tomorrow, I would start the process of filing change order claims and restructuring Torres Construction's financial practices. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of proving that the family disappointment had actually been the family's best hope for survival all along. Tonight, though, I had a pot roast dinner to look forward to, and for the first time in years, I was actually looking forward to it. Sunday dinner at the house on Maple Ridge Drive felt different than it had in years, though I couldn't immediately identify why. Maybe it was the way Mom had set the table with her good china instead of the everyday dishes, or the way Dad actually asked about my work week instead of making polite small talk about the weather. Maybe it was Christina arriving with a bottle of wine and an apology for being 15 minutes late because she'd been reviewing contract documents. Or maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in my adult life, I was sitting at my family's dinner table as someone whose opinions mattered, whose presence was genuinely wanted rather than merely tolerated. The pot roast was perfect, the way Mom's pot roast had been every Sunday for as long as I could remember. Tender beef and vegetables that had been cooking slowly all afternoon, filling the house with the kind of smell that made coming home feel like a privilege rather than an obligation. But the conversation was different, deeper somehow, as if the events of the past 2 weeks had stripped away layers of pretense and left us with something more honest to work with. Mrs. Murphy called me on Friday, Christina said, cutting her carrots into neat pieces the way she'd done since childhood. She wants to discuss the final billing for her home. Dad looked up from his plate. How did that go? We haven't met yet. The appointment is Tuesday afternoon. Christina glanced at me across the table. I was hoping Danielle might come with me. It was a small thing, asking for my help with a client meeting, but it represented a fundamental shift in how Christina saw my role in the family business. 6 months ago, she would have handled the Murphy situation herself and reported the results later. Now she was acknowledging that my perspective might be valuable from the beginning. I can do that, I said. What's your sense of how she's going to respond to the additional charges? Honestly, I think she'll be upset initially, but she'll pay. The Murphys have been talking about hiring us for a pool house project next summer, and they know the quality of work we do. Dad nodded approvingly. That's the right approach. Stand firm on legitimate costs, but maintain the relationship for future business. Speaking of future business, I said, I've been looking at the project pipeline for the next 6 months. There are some interesting opportunities if we position ourselves correctly. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me, something I never would have done at a family dinner before this month. But the boundaries between family time and business time were blurring in ways that felt natural rather than intrusive. The city is planning a major renovation of 3 elementary school buildings next year, I continued. The preliminary specifications, were just published, and they're exactly the kind of institutional projects that Torres Construction does well. Christina leaned forward with interest. What's the timeline? Bids are due in March, with construction starting in June. The project value is estimated at $2.8 million across all 3 schools. Dad's eyebrows rose. That's a significant contract. It's also exactly the kind of work that builds long-term relationships with institutional clients. School districts have ongoing maintenance and improvement needs, and they tend to work with contractors they trust. What would we need to do to be competitive? Christina asked. I spread several documents across the dining room table, turning our family dinner into an impromptu business meeting. The bid specifications emphasize energy efficiency and sustainable building practices. Torres Construction would need to partner with a mechanical contractor who specializes in high-efficiency HVAC systems and possibly bring in a sustainability consultant for the design phase. That sounds expensive, Mom said, refilling our water glasses. The partnerships would be expensive up front, but they'd position the company for a whole category of future projects, I replied. The state is requiring all public buildings to meet new energy efficiency standards by 2028. Getting experience with these systems now would make Torres Construction the go-to contractor for institutional clients who need to upgrade their facilities. Christina was reading through the bid specifications with the focused attention she brought to technical documents. This is good. Really good. How did you find out about it? I have a contact at the city planning office who keeps me informed about upcoming public sector projects. Part of my regular client work involves healthcare facility planning, so I stay current on municipal building requirements. Dad was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. So the family disappointment has been networking with city officials all along. The reference to Christina's birthday party speech could have been awkward, but it wasn't. Instead, it felt like acknowledgement of how much had changed since that night, how wrong our assumptions about each other had been. The family disappointment has been building relationships that could benefit all of us, if we're smart about how we use them, I said. After dinner, Christina and I ended up in the backyard while Mom and Dad cleaned up the kitchen. It was late October now, and the maple trees that gave the neighborhood its name were showing off their full autumn display. The air was crisp enough to require sweaters, but warm enough to make sitting on the back porch pleasant. I've been thinking about something, Christina said, settling into one of the wicker chairs Dad had built for Mom's birthday several years earlier. About the business, about our partnership, about how this is all going to work long term. What about it? I don't want you to just be a consultant who comes in to fix our financial problems and then disappears again. I want you to be a real partner in Torres Construction. I was quiet for a moment, processing what she was suggesting. What does that look like? It looks like 50-50 ownership. It looks like Torres and Torres Construction, with both our names on the business license. It looks like you having an official role in decision-making instead of just advisory input. The offer was more generous than I'd expected, and more complicated than a simple business partnership. Christina was offering to share something that had been her primary source of identity and validation for years. The family business that had made her the golden child and me the outsider. Why? I asked. 6 months ago, you didn't even want me attending family meetings? Now you want to make me an equal partner in Dad's company? Christina was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the backyard where we'd played as children, where Dad had taught us both how to use tools, and Mom had planted gardens that required more patience than either of us had possessed at age 10. Because I've realized that I was trying to be everything to everyone, and I was failing at most of it, she said finally. I was trying to be the construction expert, the business manager, the financial planner, the client relations specialist, and the family success story all at the same time, and I was mediocre at half of those things. You weren't mediocre at construction management. No, I wasn't. I'm good at managing projects, working with subcontractors, maintaining quality standards, keeping clients happy with the actual building process. That's what I should be focusing on. And the financial management, business development, strategic planning? That's what you should be focusing on, because you're good at it, and because trying to do everything myself almost cost us the family home. I thought about the offer while we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of suburban Sunday evening around us. Children playing in nearby backyards, the distant hum of traffic on the main road, the ordinary soundtrack of family. Life continuing regardless of the major decisions being made on back porches. There would have to be clear agreements about roles and responsibilities, I said. I don't want to step on your operational authority, and you'd need to respect my financial management decisions. Agreed. And I'd want to maintain my healthcare consulting practice. Torres Construction would be a major client, but not my only client. That makes sense. Diversification is probably smart for both of us. What does Dad think about this idea? Christina smiled. Dad thinks it's about time his daughters figured out how to work together instead of competing with each other. And Mom? Mom thinks it's the best idea anyone's had in years. That evening, after Christina had gone home and Mom and Dad had settled in to watch their Sunday night television programs, I walked through the house I now legally owned, thinking about ownership and partnership and the difference between having power over something and sharing power within something. The house felt familiar in ways that went deeper than childhood memories. This was where I'd learned to read, where I'd done homework at the kitchen table, where I'd gotten ready for school dances and graduation ceremonies and job interviews. But it was also where I'd learned that love could be conditional, that belonging required constant performance, that being yourself wasn't always enough to earn the acceptance you craved. Now the house was mine, legally and completely, but it didn't feel like a victory anymore. It felt like responsibility, like an opportunity to create something different for the family that would inherit it after me. I found Dad in his workshop in the basement, organizing tools and cleaning up after a weekend project. He looked up when I came down the stairs, his face showing the kind of contentment that came from working with his hands and solving practical problems. Christina told you about the partnership idea? He asked. She did. What do you think? Dad set down the wrench he'd been cleaning and turned to face me directly. I think it's exactly what the business needs. I think it's exactly what both of you need. Even though it means giving up some control over the company you built? Sweetheart, I stopped having control over this company 2 years ago when I handed the management over to Christina. The question isn't whether I'm giving up control. The question is whether the business survives long enough for me to be proud of what it becomes. And you think a partnership between Christina and me gives it the best chance? I think a partnership between Christina and you gives it the only chance. Dad picked up another tool, examining it in the light from his workbench lamp. Your sister is good at what she does, but she's not good at everything she's been trying to do. And you're good at things that none of us understood or appreciated. I'm good at things you never asked me about. That's our mistake, not yours. We assumed that because you chose a different path, you didn't have anything to contribute to our path. Dad was quiet for a moment. We were wrong about a lot of things, Danielle. But we're trying to do better. I know you are. The partnership with Christina, that's about business. But this conversation, this is about family. Dad looked directly at me. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just because you saved the house or because you're helping with the business, but because of who you are, because of the person you became despite the way we treated you. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. For 30 years, I'd been waiting to hear some version of that acknowledgement from him, some recognition that I had value independent of how well I fit into the family's expectations. Thank you, Dad. That means everything. And I want you to know that this house, the business, all of it, it's as much yours as it is Christina's. It should have been all along. 3 months later, I stood in the newly renovated offices of Torres and Torres Construction, looking out at a conference room where Christina was meeting with the design team for the elementary school renovation project we'd won in competitive bidding. The mechanical contractor we'd partnered with was explaining HVAC specifications to a group of school district officials, and everyone in the room looked engaged and optimistic about the work ahead. The business transformation had been more successful than any of us had dared hope. The change order collections had brought in enough cash to eliminate the remaining debt, and the new project management systems had improved profitability margins across all active contracts. Torres & Torres was now operating with a healthy cash flow, a solid reputation, and a pipeline of projects that extended well into the following year. But the family transformation had been even more significant. Sunday dinners had become weekly, strategy sessions where we discussed everything from individual project challenges to long-term business development opportunities. Mom had started attending these meetings, contributing insights about client relationships and community connections that none of us had fully appreciated before. Dad remained involved as senior advisor, sharing decades of industry knowledge, while allowing Christina and me to make the decisions that would shape the company's future. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was still legally mine, but it felt like it belonged to all of us in ways that went beyond property ownership. It was where we gathered for family meetings and holiday celebrations, where we celebrated business successes and worked through challenges together. It was home in the truest sense, a place where everyone belonged without having to perform or pretend or minimize themselves to fit in. My phone buzzed with a text message from Uncle Frank. Saw the Business Journal article about the school contract. Proud of you girls for turning things around. The Business Journal article had been very different from the one that had appeared 6 months earlier. This one was about successful family business partnerships, about sisters who had found ways to combine complementary skills for mutual success. The headline read, Torres and Torres Construction, a new model for family business evolution. No mention of disappointments or failures or public embarrassments at birthday parties. Just a story about transformation, collaboration, and the power of recognizing what people are actually good at instead of what you assume they should be good at. Christina appeared in my office doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that came from closing a difficult negotiation. Successfully. The school district approved the sustainability upgrades, she said, handing me one of the cups. All 3 buildings will get the high-efficiency systems, and they want us to bid on the middle school renovation project next year. That's fantastic. What's the additional contract value? $400,000, spread over 2 years, and it establishes us as the go-to contractor for institutional energy efficiency projects in the district. I pulled up our financial projections on my computer screen. That puts us ahead of revenue targets for the next 18 months. We can start thinking about expanding the crew and maybe investing in some additional equipment. Careful planning and strategic growth, Christina said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Who would have thought that could work? Anyone who was paying attention to business fundamentals instead of trying to prove how successful they could look. Christina laughed. Are you going to keep reminding me about my strategic mistakes forever? Only until you make new ones for me to tease you about. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, reviewing contract documents and financial projections like the business partners we'd become. It wasn't the family relationship either of us had imagined growing up, but it was better than what we'd imagined. It was built on mutual respect and complementary skills rather than competition and comparison. Danielle, Christina's voice was more serious now. Do you ever regret it? The way everything happened, the confrontations, the way we had to tear everything down before we could build it back up? I thought about the question honestly. The past year had been difficult in ways I'd never experienced before. Family conflicts that had simmered under the surface for decades had erupted into open confrontation, forcing all of us to examine assumptions and behaviors that had felt natural but were actually destructive. I regret that it took a crisis to get us here, I said finally. I regret that we spent so many years misunderstanding each other and wasting opportunities to work together. But I don't regret the outcome. Even the part where you had to publicly embarrass me to get my attention? I didn't set out to embarrass you. I set out to prevent you from losing the house and destroying Dad's business. The embarrassment was just a side effect of the truth becoming public. Christina nodded thoughtfully. The truth. That's what it was really about, wasn't it? Not revenge or proving a point, but just making sure everyone understood what was actually happening instead of what we all pretended was happening. The truth about the finances, the truth about our respective skills, the truth about how we'd been treating each other for years. I turned away from my computer screen to look directly at her. The truth about what we could accomplish if we stopped competing and started collaborating. And now we're building something together that's better than anything either of us could have built alone. As evening approached, I drove back to my downtown apartment, past the office buildings where I still maintained my healthcare consulting practice, past the restaurants and shops that had been part of my life during the years when I'd felt disconnected from my family. The city looked the same as it always had, but my relationship to it had changed. It was no longer a refuge from family obligations, but simply one part of a life that now included both professional independence and family partnership. My apartment felt different too, smaller somehow, but in a good way. It was still my space, my retreat, my reminder that I could build a life that was entirely my own. But it was no longer the only place where I felt like myself. Now I felt like myself at family dinners, in business meetings, at the house on Maple Ridge Drive that I owned but that belonged to all of us. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, looking out at the Columbus skyline and thinking about power and partnership, and the difference between being right and being effective. I'd been right about Christina's financial mismanagement, right about the risks to the family business, right about my own undervalued contributions to potential family success. But being right hadn't been enough. What had made the difference was being strategic, being patient, being willing to use power in ways that created solutions rather than just proving points. The family disappointment had become the family partner, not through demands or ultimatums, but through competence, consistency, and the kind of long-term thinking that builds sustainable relationships rather than temporary victories. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mom. Thank you for coming to dinner today. It means the world to have both my daughters working together. I typed back, thank you for raising daughters who eventually figured out how to work together. The response came quickly. Thank you for being patient with us while we learned how to see you clearly. Outside my window, Columbus sparkled with the lights of people going about their Sunday evening routines, finishing homework and preparing for work weeks and making plans for futures they were building one decision at a time. Somewhere across the city, Christina was probably reviewing project schedules for the coming week. Mom and Dad were watching television in the living room of the house I owned, but we all shared. And I was exactly where I belonged. Part of a family that had finally learned to value what each member actually brought to the table, rather than what they wished each member would bring instead. The disappointment had become the solution. The outsider had become the partner. The underestimated daughter had become the person who saved everything that mattered. Not through destruction or revenge, but through the simple revolutionary act of being entirely, unapologetically herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.